She sat in the back row of every briefing, notebook open, shoulders squared, eyes forward. Captain Sarah Chen, 28 years old, 5'4", barely visible behind the wall of broad-shouldered men who filled the operations center at Fort Benning. She never raised her hand, never interrupted, never drew attention to herself in a room that ran on volume and bravado. The other officers called her the Mouse. Not to her face, they had that much restraint, but in the hallways, over beers at the officers' club, in the locker room, banter that defined the unofficial hierarchy of the battalion. Captain Chen, they said, was brilliant on paper, top of her class at West Point. Distinguished graduate from Ranger School, one of only a handful of women to earn the tab. But here, in the testosterone-heavy world of the 75th Ranger Regiment's training cadre, she was invisible. She didn't fit the mold, didn't swagger, didn't dominate conversations with war stories or tactical one-upmanship. In a culture that equated presence with leadership, her quietness read as weakness. Her careful precision looked like hesitation. And so, they overlooked her, week after week, as they planned the most critical training evolution of the year, Iron Gauntlet, a 36-hour field exercise designed to break Ranger candidates and rebuild them into something harder. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb ran the show. 42, barrel-chested, with a voice that could carry across a firing range without a microphone. He'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Silver Star in Helmand Province, and he ran his training battalion like a combat deployment. No margin for error, no tolerance for softness, and absolutely no patience for officers who couldn't command a room. "Gentlemen," he'd say at the start of every briefing, even though Captain Chen sat 3 rows back. "Iron Gauntlet is where we separate warriors from paper pushers." She never corrected him, never pointed out the oversight. She just took notes, her pen moving in neat, economical lines across the page. The other captains, Hendricks, Morrison, Kowalski, they were Webb's favorites, combat veterans all with the scars and stories to prove it. They pitched scenarios with confidence, talked through tactical problems with aggressive certainty, made decisions fast and loud. Webb loved that, rewarded it, gave them the high visibility assignments, the leadership positions that would look good on their next promotion board. Chen got administrative tasks, logistics, supply coordination, the unglamorous work that kept the machine running but earned no glory. "Chen," Webb said one afternoon, barely looking up from his tablet, "make sure we've got enough blank ammunition for the night infiltration scenario, and check the medevac helicopter schedule. Last thing we need is a gap in coverage." "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady, professional, unremarkable. Hendricks smirked as she left the room. "Queen of the spreadsheets," he muttered. Morrison laughed. "Bet she color codes her combat boots." No one defended her, not even Major Elena Rodriguez, the only other woman in the training cadre who'd learned long ago that solidarity was a luxury you couldn't afford when you were still proving yourself. But here's what they didn't see. Sarah Chen was always working. While the other officers joked and postured, she was mapping contingencies. She'd walked every inch of the training area, 20 square miles of Georgia pine forest, swamp, and red clay hills. She knew where the terrain got soft after rain, where the old logging roads could support heavy vehicles, where the creek crossings turned treacherous. She'd studied injury patterns from previous exercises, analyzed casualty rates, identified the scenarios most likely to go wrong. She wasn't hesitant. She was thorough. She wasn't invisible. She was watching. And she'd seen something no one else had noticed. 3 weeks before Iron Gauntlet, she'd stayed late in the operations center, cross-referencing weather forecasts with terrain analysis. A tropical depression was forming in the Gulf of Mexico. Models showed a 30% chance it would strengthen and move inland during the exercise window. Not enough for Webb to cancel. He'd never cancel for a weather forecast, but enough to make her uneasy. She ran scenarios. If the storm hit, the low-lying areas would flood. The creek that looked like a minor obstacle on the map would become a raging torrent. The rally point they'd selected for casualty collection, a clearing on high ground, would be cut off by rising water. And the dirt access road the medevac helicopter used, it would turn to soup. She drafted a memo, proposed alternate routes, suggested repositioning the rally point to higher ground with better access. She included maps, data, risk assessments, everything Webb claimed to value in his officers. She handed it to him after a briefing. He glanced at it for maybe 10 seconds. "Chen, I appreciate the initiative, but we've been running Iron Gauntlet on this terrain for 6 years. We know what we're doing." "Sir, the weather pattern, it's a 30% chance. That means 70% chance it doesn't happen. We're not redesigning an entire evolution because of a forecast." He handed the memo back. Focus on your assigned tasks, Captain. We need you locked in on logistics. She could have pushed, could have escalated, but she knew how that story ended for junior officers who contradicted their battalion commander, especially junior officers who already carried the burden of not fitting in. So she said, "Yes, sir," and filed the memo away. But she didn't stop working the problem. Over the next 3 weeks, she quietly built redundancies into the logistics plan. She pre-positioned extra medical supplies at multiple points. She coordinated with the motor pool to have additional vehicles on standby, ones with higher ground clearance. She memorized AC alternate routes, helicopter landing zones, evacuation corridors. She did it all without authorization, without fanfare, working late nights and early mornings while the other officers slept or drank, or congratulated themselves on their brilliance. No one noticed, no one cared. And then the storm hit. Iron Gauntlet launched on a Thursday morning under gray skies. 200 Ranger candidates divided into 4 platoons, each led by a cadre officer. Hendricks had 1st platoon, the glory assignment. Morrison took 2nd. Kowalski had 3rd. Chen, predictably, got 4th platoon, the one cobbled together from holdovers and academic recycles, the candidates nobody else wanted. "Try not to lose any of them, Mouse," Morrison said with a grin as they boarded the trucks. She didn't respond, just checked her gear one more time and climbed in with her platoon. The exercise started normally: navigation lanes through dense forest, ambush drills in the hills, river crossings under simulated fire. The candidates struggled, they were supposed to, but the cadre maintained control. By nightfall, everyone was wet, exhausted, and moving on pure determination. Then the rain started, not the light drizzle Webb had expected, a deluge. The tropical depression had strengthened faster than predicted, and now it was stalled over central Georgia, dumping inches of rain per hour. Within 90 minutes, the creek started rising. Within 2 hours, the low ground was flooding. At the operations center, Webb watched the weather radar and made a decision. We push through. These candidates need to learn that combat doesn't stop for bad weather. But in the field, the situation was deteriorating fast. Radio reports came in fragmented, half drowned by static and rain. Hendricks, 1st platoon is behind schedule. Terrain is worse than expected. Morrison, 2nd platoon has 2 candidates with hypothermia symptoms, requesting guidance. Kowalski, 3rd platoon lost the route. We're repositioning. And then, nothing from Chen. Her radio had gone silent an hour earlier, and no one had thought much of it. 4th platoon, the rejects. They were probably just moving slow, dealing with their own problems. But Webb was starting to worry. Not about Chen, about the optics of losing a female officer in a training accident. That would bring investigations, media attention, career-ending scrutiny. "Get me a location on 4th platoon," he barked. The operations sergeant tried, couldn't raise them on the radio. Their GPS trackers were showing, but not moving. They were stationary at a position that made no sense. 2 miles off course, deep in the low ground near the creek system. "What the hell is she doing down there?" Webb muttered. He sent a runner, tried the emergency channel, got nothing. And then, at midnight, the call came in. Not from Chen, from the medevac helicopter pilot. "Sir, we've got a situation. The primary rally point is underwater. Repeat, primary rally point is flooded and inaccessible. We can't land." Webb felt his stomach drop. 2nd platoon had 3 candidates who needed immediate evacuation, hypothermia cases that were sliding toward critical. Morrison had gotten them to the rally point, but now they were trapped. The helicopter circling overhead, rotors beating rain, nowhere to land, and 3 young soldiers losing body heat by the minute. "Find an alternate LZ," Webb ordered. "Sir, the terrain is too soft everywhere else. We'll bog down or clip trees." Webb stared at the map. Every contingency he'd planned for assumed the primary rally point would be accessible. He'd ignored Chen's memo, dismissed her concerns, and now soldiers were in danger because of it. Then a new voice crackled over the radio, calm, clear, unmistakable. "Operations Center, this is 4th Platoon Actual, Captain Sarah Chen." "Go ahead, 4th Platoon," the operations sergeant said, relief flooding his voice. "Be advised, I have a suitable helicopter landing zone at Grid November, Victor 734652. Hard ground, clear approaches, accessible by vehicle. I can accept casualties from any element." Webb grabbed the handset. "Chen, where the hell have you been?" "Preparing for contingencies, sir." Her voice was steady, professional, not defensive, not smug, just stating fact. "I observed the weather deterioration and moved my platoon to higher ground with vehicle access. I have heated shelters established, medical supplies staged, and transportation standing by." There was a pause. Webb looked at the map. The grid she'd given was in a completely different sector, off the planned route, in an area he hadn't even considered, but it was high ground, dry ground, exactly where she'd recommended 3 weeks ago. How long to get Morrison's casualties to your location? If he follows the route I'm transmitting now, 22 minutes by vehicle, helicopter can be overhead in 6. Webb made the decision. Do it. All elements, reroute casualties to 4th Platoon's position. Chen, you're now the primary rally point for this evolution. Over the next 4 hours, Sarah Chen became the anchor point for the entire exercise. She coordinated 3 helicopter evacuations. She directed 6 vehicle movements through terrain that would have been impassable without her pre-positioned markers. She provided hot food and dry shelter for candidates from all 4 platoons as they cycled through her position. She did it without drama, without celebration, just calm, competent execution of a plan she'd built weeks earlier, working through problems no one else had wanted to acknowledge. At 0400, when the rain finally slowed, Webb stood in Chen's improvised command post, a GP medium tent with a field table covered in laminated maps and neatly organized casualty cards. 4th Platoon's candidates were asleep in dry clothes, wrapped in warming blankets. The candidates from other platoons who'd passed through looked better than they had, any right to, given the conditions. "Captain," Webb said quietly. She turned, fatigue evident in her eyes, but her posture still straight. "Sir, why didn't you tell me you were doing all this?" She considered the question. "I did tell you, sir. You told me to focus on my assigned tasks, so I did. I just interpreted my tasks more broadly than you intended." He almost smiled. "You disobeyed my guidance." "No, sir. You told me to make sure we had adequate medical coverage and logistics support. That's what I did. You didn't specify where or how." Webb shook his head. "You could have just followed orders." "Following orders and preparing for reality aren't mutually exclusive, sir." She met his eyes. "You taught us that Ranger School is about thinking under pressure, making decisions when the plan falls apart. I assumed that applied to cadre officers, too." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your memo. The one I dismissed. You were right. I wasn't trying to be right, sir. I was trying to be ready." That's when it clicked for Webb. Chen wasn't trying to show anyone up, wasn't playing politics or angling for recognition. She was just doing the job the way she'd been trained to do it, thoroughly, thoughtfully, with every contingency mapped. While the other officers had been focused on looking impressive, she'd been focused on being effective. The difference was profound. When they returned to Fort Benning the next afternoon, Webb called an after-action review. Every officer in the training cadre attended, along with the battalion sergeant major and several company commanders. Webb stood at the front of the room, his uniform still muddy from the field. "Gentlemen," he said, then paused and corrected himself. "Officers, Iron Gauntlet was a success despite conditions that could have turned it into a disaster. We evacuated 12 casualties safely, maintained training standards, and brought every candidate home. That success is due to one person's planning and execution." He pulled up a map on the projection screen. Chen's alternate routes marked in red, her rally points circled. "Captain Chen identified the risk weeks ago. She briefed me. I dismissed her. She could have left it there, followed orders, stuck to her lane, let someone else own the problem. Instead, she built redundancies, pre-positioned resources, and established contingencies that saved this evolution." Webb looked directly at Hendricks, Morrison, Kowalski. "While some of you were focused on commanding your platoons, Chen was thinking 3 steps ahead. While you were managing the moment, she was managing the mission. That's the difference between good leadership and great leadership." The room was silent. Chen sat in her usual spot, 3 rows back, expression neutral. But something had shifted in how the other officers looked at her. Webb continued. "Effective immediately, Captain Chen is the lead planner for all future training evolutions. She'll have final authority on contingency operations and risk mitigation. If she says we need to adjust a plan, we adjust the plan." He paused. "Because being loud doesn't make you right, being confident doesn't make you competent, and being overlooked doesn't mean you're not essential." After the meeting, the other officers approached her differently, not with apologies, that would have required an admission they'd been wrong, but with questions. Real questions about her planning process, her risk assessments, her methodology. Chen answered each one with the same measured professionalism she'd always shown, neither resentful nor triumphant. Major Rodriguez caught up with her in the hallway. "That took guts," she said quietly. Chen shook her head. "It took a weather forecast and basic contingency planning. It took doing the right thing when your commander told you not to." Chen considered that. "He didn't tell me not to. He just didn't see the value. That's different." "Is it?" "I think so. If he'd forbidden me from preparing alternates, I would have stopped, but he just dismissed the idea. That left room for me to work the problem my own way. Rodriguez smiled. That's a generous interpretation. Maybe. But I don't think Colonel Webb is a bad leader. He just had blind spots. We all do. The question is whether we're willing to see them when someone points them out. 2 months later, the promotion board results came through. Captain Sarah Chen was selected for early promotion to major. The citation specifically mentioned her exceptional tactical planning and crisis management during complex training operations. Webb called her into his office. Congratulations, Major Chen. Thank you, sir. For what it's worth, I'm sorry I didn't listen earlier. She met his eyes. You listened when it mattered, sir. That's what counts. Did I? Or did you just force me to listen by being undeniably right? Chen smiled slightly. Those aren't mutually exclusive either, sir. Webb laughed. You know what they used to call you? Before Iron Gauntlet? The Mouse. He winced. You heard that? I did. It didn't bother me. Why not? Because mice survive by being observant, adaptable, and underestimated. In the right context, those are strengths. Webb shook his head in admiration. I'm assigning you to develop our new training doctrine. You'll brief the division commander next month. I'll be ready, sir. I know you will. He extended his hand. The Army needs more officers like you, Chen. Officers who do the work without needing the spotlight, who solve problems before they become crises, who understand that leadership isn't about volume, it's about vision. She shook his hand. Then maybe the Army should stop training us to equate the two, sir. He nodded slowly. Maybe we should. 6 months later, at the division change of command ceremony, General Patricia Hargrove, 2-star, commander of the entire Infantry Center of Excellence, stood at the podium addressing 3,000 soldiers. She was talking about the future of Army training, the need for adaptive thinking, the importance of leaders who could see around corners. Excellence in leadership, she said, isn't always loud, it's not always obvious. Sometimes it's the quiet officer in the corner who's doing the most important work. She paused and looked directly at the formation of officers standing at attention. Major Sarah Chen, front and center. Chen stepped forward, her movements crisp and economical, the same precise bearing she'd always had, but now everyone was watching. The general presented her with the Meritorious Service Medal for exceptional planning and risk mitigation that prevented potential training fatalities and established new standards for contingency operations. Major Chen's leadership exemplifies the vision and adaptability required of modern Army officers. As the general pinned the medal to Chen's uniform, she said quietly, I read your after-action report, the one about how assumptions and unconscious bias nearly cost us lives. It was the most important document I've read this year. Chen nodded. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Major, for having the courage to be right when everyone else wanted you to be wrong. The ceremony ended. The formation dispersed. As Chen walked back to her company area, Lieutenant Colonel Webb fell into step beside her. You know what the best part is? He said. Sir, they don't call you the Mouse anymore. Chen smiled. What do they call me? The Prophet, because you see things before they happen. She laughed, a genuine unguarded sound that Webb had never heard from her before. That's worse, sir. Now they'll expect me to be right all the time. Aren't you? No, I just prepare for enough scenarios that I'm usually covered. She glanced at him. Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being ready for imperfection. Webb stopped walking. Chen stopped too, turned to face him. You changed how I lead, he said. You made me question assumptions I didn't even know I had. That wasn't my goal, sir. I know. That's why it worked. They stood there for a moment, officer and officer, equals in a way they hadn't been before. For what it's worth, Webb said, I'm glad I was wrong about you. You weren't wrong about me, sir. You were just looking at the wrong things. What should I have been looking at? Not what I said in briefings, what I was doing between them. Chen smiled. Leadership isn't a performance. It's preparation meeting opportunity. Where'd you learn that? Ranger School. They taught us that the hard problems don't get solved by the loudest voice in the room. They get solved by the person who's done the most work before the room even assembled. Webb nodded slowly. I need to remember that. We all do, sir. She saluted and walked away, the new rank on her collar catching the late afternoon sun. Behind her, the training grounds stretched out across the Georgia. Landscape, miles of forest and hills where young soldiers learn to be rangers, where officers learn to lead, where quiet competence occasionally, finally, got the recognition it deserved. Sarah Chen had never needed the spotlight, but now that it had found her, she'd use it the way she used everything else, thoughtfully, efficiently, in service of making the next mission safer and more effective. Because that's what leaders do when they're not performing leadership. They're actually leading. The Army would be slower to change than she wanted. Unconscious bias doesn't evaporate after one successful training exercise. But Webb would be different now. Major Rodriguez would tell the story to other junior officers. The Ranger candidates who'd sheltered in Chen's rally point would remember. And slowly, story by story, one mission at a time, the culture would shift. Not because someone had demanded it, but because someone had proven there was a better way. And sometimes that quiet proof is louder than any words. Chen didn't become a hero that night in the rain. She just became visible. And in an organization built on presence and volume, visibility was its own kind of revolution. She'd spent years being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. She could have been angry, could have been bitter. Instead, she'd taken that invisibility and used it. Used it to work without interference, to prepare without scrutiny, to build something solid while others built reputations. In the end, the work spoke for itself. And that, more than any medal or promotion, was the real victory. Because courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's patient, sometimes it's the voice that says, "I see a problem," when everyone else says, "There is no problem." Sometimes courage is preparing for the storm everyone else refuses to acknowledge. Sometimes it's being right when being right means standing alone. And sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet officer in the corner is the one who saves everyone else. They'd dismissed her because she didn't fit their definition of leadership. But she'd redefined leadership anyway, not by arguing for a seat at the table, but by building a better table when the old one collapsed. That's not just competence, that's mastery. And the Army, slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably, was learning to recognize the difference. The story of Sarah Chen would be told in training courses for years to come, not as a story about gender, not as a story about bias, though both were present, but as a story about what leadership actually looks like when you strip away the performance and focus on the purpose. She never called herself a hero. But every officer who learned from her mistakes, from Webb's mistakes, would carry that lesson forward. And that's how cultures change. Not through manifestos or mandates, but through moments. Through quiet officers who refuse to stop working just because no one's watching. Through people who understand that being overlooked is not the same as being overlooked is not the same as being powerless. History doesn't always remember the quiet acts of courage, but maybe it should. Because wars are won by logistics as often as tactics. Lives are saved by preparation as often as heroics. And the best leaders aren't always the ones standing at the front of the room. Sometimes they're sitting in the back, 3 rows deep, taking notes, waiting for the moment when their work becomes undeniable, waiting for someone to finally call their name.